are listening.
Welcome to Talk About with me, Amanda Baker. This is Jambo Radio's brand new social debate programme where we will be exploring a range of contemporary topics with invited guests. Today we are going to talk about the relevance of unions post-COVID, post-Brexit. And what better subject in a part of Scotland known historically for its industry, its innovations, production, along with the accompanying struggles for workers' rights. Here we are in Renfrewshire. Paisley in Renfrewshire is an area that has historically been spurred to grow and develop and innovate with an influx of peoples and ideas. And this starts right back to 565 AD with Mirren, later Saint Mirren, not just a football team, an Irish missionary who established a religious community which led to the building of the famous Paisley Abbey, a centre renowned for piety and learning where, reportedly, William Wallace himself was schooled by monks. Industrially, as well as obviously shipbuilding on the Clyde, this area is known for the development of strong new cotton threads, weaving and textiles during the Industrial Revolution. That technology came from Holland in the 1700s. This area was also the location for the production of a very funky little car called the Hillman Imp. And I am not going to insult anybody in Renfrewshire who may have been involved in its development, but I do remember it from the 1970s, and it is a very strange car, which ended up having actually a bit of a cult following. And I believe, and I'm willing for anybody in the area to put me right on this, that, oh, a bit of music there, that we used to have to weight the front of the car in order to deal with the steering. For myself, my own family had a Triumph Herald, and that actually had the opposite problem. In that, as a family, we all had to get out of the car if my dad wanted to drive it up any steep hills. Now we've moved to a time where there is a vibrant African and Caribbean community making its mark in this part of Scotland. Nowhere more clearly demonstrated than the establishment of this radio, Jambo Radio. As society and the workplace has evolved, the friction between employers and workers has ebbed and flowed. With COVID, Brexit, and economic uncertainty, coupled with the diverse communities here on our doorstep, there cannot be a hotter topic to begin with than unions and their relevance in the modern world. I'm delighted to introduce our very first guest on Talk About. Her name is Chigozie Jo Adigwe, known to us here on Jamwo, a previous contributor as Gozie. Gozie was born in Glasgow a few months after her father passed away, leaving her mum the backbone of a family with 3 children newly arrived from Nigeria. It was while studying pharmacology at Aberdeen University that she became involved in politics, where she campaigned on behalf of students and low-income communities. She has worked in the private and voluntary sectors and enjoyed a brief stint running her own catering business, Afra Catering. So this is someone who literally likes having a lot on her plate. Gozie has worked in community engagement posts for 15 years, has been a community union member for nearly 12 years, and she is a member of the Scottish TUC Black Workers Committee. If that isn't enough, she has 2 children, but manages to enjoy cooking, music and gardening. Welcome, Gozi. We're absolutely delighted to have you here. Actually, I have to tell you, I nearly left that end bit off because it reminded me a little bit of the 1970s beauty pageants. You know, Gozi enjoys gardening, cooking and saving the world. But we are delighted to have you here as our union expert. So, let's kick off. Tell us, if you will, and our listeners, a little bit about you and your evolution from student activist to union campaigner. Gozi.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Amanda, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here live at Jambo, an endeavour that I've supported ever since its launch a few months after I took up a post in Renfrewshire myself. I started university in Aberdeen when I was 17. By that point I was quite politically active and I joined a political party, I'm allowed to say.
You can tell us, you
I
joined
joined
it?
the Labour Party. Through my years at university I became more and more involved with grassroots campaigning, involved in the conference and planning of objectives from year to year for students in the Labour Party. But also it was at the time where the poll tax was on our doorstep, so there was a lot of campaigning around how to support the objection to what we felt was a very unfair tax. Through those years, the Labour Party supported me. I became the president of the Labour Party in Aberdeen, and over a period of years, a small but significant number of us carried through some of these objectives and just clear aims round about how we wanted to equalise society. That for me has always been a very important endeavour. When I left university, I became very, I suppose, involved in trying to establish myself in a career, and a career that was relevant to the degrees that I'd received. So to some extent my political activity fell by the wayside. However, when I did get into the workplace, and particularly when I came into the voluntary sector about 15 years ago, I actually just stumbled into becoming a trades union member. The trades union that I became a member of was a sister member to a sight loss organisation that I was working with at the moment, and it was very much a case of they were opportunistically recruiting at our head office in Edinburgh, and I thought that that was a natural opportunity for me to express some of the campaigning activities that I'd been enjoying during my political party days. And for a while it was quite dormant, I didn't do so much. However, my trade union is community union, and over a period of time, I would say like a short period of time actually, it was recognised that as being a Labour Party activist, and as being a black female, and as being one of only two black activists within the membership of Community Living in Scotland, I was regularly approached to become involved in different activities and in different events, conferences and policy forums and training through Community Union. I took up a number of those opportunities, and that led me to become a member of the Black Workers Committee, the Scottish TUC Black Workers Committee, which is one of 4 equalities committees that are supported by the STUC that do a range of campaigning and a rolling year-on-year business plan about how we challenge inequality, increase civic representation of what we would call, I suppose, either underrepresented or marginalised people in society. I was chair of the STUC Black Workers Committee for a year, and had the opportunity to take forward some quite quite significant developments in terms of health inequalities and civic representation as well, being able to provide a space and a platform for ethnic minority people to be vocal, to be prominent, and to have exposure in areas where they hadn't been so before. So essentially that's what I've been chipping away at over the years, and I've combined that with my community engagement roles, which have very much worked, again, alongside communities who we consider to be marginalised or high risk from particular health inequalities, and they've complemented each other well, I would say, over the years, and that's where my passion lies.
Fantastic. And actually, Gozi, all of that leans to why we're so delighted to have you here talking around this subject, your breadth and depth of experience, not just directly in the trade union movement, but in a lot of these areas around. You mentioned equality and inequality as an integral part of all of this. And funnily enough, that was something you and I discussed when we did the talk panel on Kamala Harris and the whole importance of that development for black women in Scotland. And I do remember members of the panel saying at the time that a lot of these issues of equality and inequality were things we had imagined, had hoped might be much further developed by now. So thank you. That's a lovely start. Right, I'm going to pitch in now and hang up our sort of first substantial issue on the Jambo washing line and let you throw some mud at it. Okay. Before the so-called Winter of Discontent in 1978-9, which I remember, which ushered in the Thatcher government, union membership in the UK stood at over 13 million. It has effectively declined ever since, despite a growing workforce. It's approximately half that today, depending whose statistics you read. However, as a proportion of that decreased membership, women and black people are actually relatively well represented as in the membership. But with a more fragmented workforce, spread of 0 hours contracts, move to service-based economy, overall union membership does remain low compared to certainly when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s. And I'm getting there to the point now. Of that reduced membership, according to TUC figures, the vast majority are over the age of 35, which means we have generations of young workers growing up without the trade union culture. So here's the question. In the uncertainty post-COVID, post-Brexit, do we need to re-educate younger people about the benefits of union membership? And on a more personal level, what would you say, especially to your teenage daughter, about the importance of being a member of a relevant workplace union?
Yeah, well, that's a good series of questions. I would say that ultimately union membership has decreased quite massively over the years, as you said, from the 78 Winter of Discontent, where culturally there was a different approach and perception of trade unionism. I think trade unionism and being a member of a trade union became something that was quite a political football. Obviously, with trade unions having their origins in the Labour Party, what the Conservative Party and governments did considerably well over a period of time was to somehow deteriorate the principles around collective organising and collective organisation in the workplace. and also workplaces, as just environments themselves were changing massively across the UK, and they still are, from industry into more service-based economies now. Fast forward to now, I think there are two issues. Firstly, trade unions perhaps have to do some reflection in how they are perceived by young people and how they're perceived in workplaces generally, and what the benefits actually are of being a part of a union. For young people, it might be the case that it's not something that is seen as relevant to them because they're resilient, they either have support, family support, etc. But increasingly what we're seeing is that because of zero-hour contracts, because of the gig economy, and ultimately because of austerity, and then on the back of that, the pandemic crisis, young people are actually at the sharp ends of some of the challenges with regards to employment. And that goes hand in hand with health, with mental health, with health inequalities. So there are probably a couple of key messages that young people have to take on board, and I think it's the responsibility of trade unions to articulate those key messages. And I'm pleased to say that within the STUC, one of the equalities committees is a youth committee. There's also various other branches and wraparound networks within the STUC that promote campaigns that try and raise the interest, the motivation of young people, particularly around what we see as the gig economy and the challenge around about a living wage. So trade unions have to articulate those messages and keep punting them out and make them relevant to the current context. Certainly during the last year, employment and employability has been a really, really big issue, particularly for ethnic minority young people. What I would say to my daughter, well, at this point, not very much, because she's 17 and she can answer me back too eloquently, to be honest. So
Be there.
I tend to just ask her what she wants for her dinner. But Daisy and my son have been on regular demonstrations with me, STUC demonstrations, either St Andrew's Days marches, anti-racism events. They've come to conferences, been involved with some of the younger people's events with me as well. And that's how I've chosen to try and articulate to them the importance during their young years of what I do and how it affects people beneficially. I think that in time I will have that conversation, that sit-down conversation with Daisy, but at the moment I prefer to give her examples of what I do and to bring her on board with some of the campaigns and activities that we are involved in as a trade union, and get her to understand why it's still relevant. You mentioned something about we would have hoped that things would have changed significantly by now. Well, I can tell you that within the Black Workers Committee, I'm kind of one of the young team. Those who established the Black Workers Committee about 20 years ago now, they're saying the same thing, Amanda. They're saying, well, what's changed? What's changed? And change, it comes slow. Change comes slow. Things have changed from 20 years ago to now. Not as much as we would have liked. But what we have to do is to make sure that we can hand over that baton to our younger generation in a way that's relevant to them here and now, in a context that they're able to grapple and take up, sort of some clear vision in terms of campaigns and putting their desires in a solid voice, in a voice that's together. Some of that is round about like how do they engage digitally or with social media? How do we encourage them to be active? I used to think that being involved in social media and, you know, liking or reposting campaign, you know, sort of information was a bit armchair activism. But over the period of time, I've actually realised that armchair activism through social media is a very good route to be able to drive messages through, and it doesn't have to be only armchair activism. It can be, you know, sort of complemented by a range of other sort of approaches that young people, I think, should be encouraged to take up. But we as older people have to understand that medium and understand what the issues are here and now.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm fascinated what you had to say there about your daughter. Having survived 3 teenage girls, I wish I had thought of one of the ways of getting them to let off steam might have been to take them on some political rallies. That would have been a really good idea. I couldn't get them to do the washing up though, so I don't know how much luck I'd have had with that. As for, yeah, I'm fascinated, as you know, Gosi, I'm really not on social media, and George and I are dancing around this at the moment. He's trying to persuade me that I need to be on Twitter, and I'm trying to explain to him that that's like trying to get a vegetarian into an abattoir. So we'll continue that. But it sounds like you would be on George's side. Okay, but linked to that and touching on something that you mentioned in that fascinating insight there, let's talk a bit about the gig economy. I know that is an area that interests you hugely, and especially from the point of view of the new work culture and unions and how they interact with that. And let me just throw something in here, because the question I'm going to ask you basically is, are unions having to reinvent the wheel? And the reason I ask that is if we think back a few months to the legal decision, which I think a lot of people will remember, the Uber decision, and there was a young man who headed up that action, and it was on the one hand hugely encouraging that it was successful, and yet wasn't there a negative element that we were basically looking at someone who managed to get the courts to agree that people who were working for this company should be treated like workers? I mean, how far back down the track has this taken us? So I know this is an area that interests you, so tell me your thoughts on that.
I mean, I don't see the developments and transformation of trade unions as being about reinventing the wheel, but more about being relevant to the current context. The nature of trade unions over their inception and their growth over many years was about supporting and defending workers in the workplace. The workplace has changed massively now, and while we do have some negative opinions about the gig economy, to some extent, you know, the gig economy suits certain workers, and so you have that diversity of workforce that are over-reliant on the gig economy, or actually find it quite a satisfactory place to be. And I think the trade union movement has to recognise that and to pitch itself to perhaps who is the most vulnerable within the gig economy. The benefit of being a trade union member is based around, you know, having advocacy, having support, having a network within, you know, an organisation and beyond. and being able to increase your pay potentially. Those are all benefits that I still feel are perhaps not communicated as well as they could be from trade unions to this new evolving population of the workforce. But certainly within the STUC and some of the work that my union, Community Union, does is based around how to increase, for instance, awareness of a living wage. And messages like that are messages that really resonate within the gig economy workforce. And if it can be the case that those kind of messages have traction, then I think the trade union movement can take a slight diversion to change and to transition into a way that's more relevant for private sector.
Gozi, I'm gonna dive, just because I do find this incredibly interesting, and maybe because it's an area that I am so ignorant about. But I'm just going to pull you back to this issue, and maybe the way I phrase the question, it's not so much about reinventing the wheel. Maybe what I should have said is, are unions having to fight battles that we thought were long in the past? Because I absolutely hear what you're saying about what unions can do in terms of improving wages and working conditions, and we know that on the whole unionised workers do enjoy better pay, better conditions, blah blah blah, all down that route. But the Uber case caught my ear in particular because these people were at a much more basic level than that, having to prove that they were workers, having to fight for the right to, am I correct, have holiday? I mean, it was, the kind of battles, we talked a little bit at the beginning about the Industrial Revolution, and the difference between a worker and a serf, a medieval peasant, a slave, is that they have this right to be treated as humans, to receive remuneration, and the Uber thing to me seemed to be several steps back in terms of union history. Come back at me on that one.
Well, I mean, I think you have a fair point there. Ultimately, trade unions their bread and butter, their mainstay is to uphold workers' rights, and the workplace has changed very dramatically from, like you said, serfdom, slavery, industrialised workplaces through to what we have now in terms of the gig economy. I mean, it can't be ignored that the elephant in the room has been an absolute massive drive towards consumer capitalism, and that has played a very big part in not only enhancing the influence of big business, but also, possibly more importantly, shifting the mindsets of workers themselves, and that has perhaps played a part in how workers have not perceived the benefits of being a part of a trade union to the same extent that they perhaps would have done back in the day. But I would say that also trade unions are very adept now at building in sort of additional support mechanisms for workers, like training, capacity building, learning, etc., in order that people can inform themselves and make informed decisions in their workplaces, and obviously supported by union reps, makes, when there is a grievance or where there is a particularly challenging situation at work, makes it the potential to have a resolution that is more in a worker's favour than not. All of these points need to be communicated on a regular basis, and some unions, I would say, are better at it than others. Some unions have been perhaps more successful in recruiting from gig economy and from the private sector on the back of some of these messages. Certainly I know Community Union, although it's a small union, has had, over a period of years, has had an increase in membership because of the fact that they have stepped out of industrialised workplaces and found membership, recruitment and key messages that resonate in the private sector. So it's about evolving. Nothing stays the same, Amanda. Everything changes all the time.
Yeah. Okay, let's sort of pivot a little bit. We may come back to that. Historically, significant numbers of very particularly Caribbean workers have worked in the public sector and specifically the NHS. It's no coincidence that the NHS came into being in 1948, the same year that Windrush arrived on these shores. These two things are absolutely integral. Many families of Caribbean heritage, including my own, have a strong tradition of working in the NHS and other public sector areas that are strongly unionised. My mum worked her whole life in the NHS. Two of my grown-up daughters work in the NHS. We've also seen over recent months the hit that a lot of black people have taken on the front line in COVID, in the National Health Service, along with the new wave of migrant workers and European workers who've been made to feel so incredibly unwelcome as a result of Brexit. And in my mind, I wonder how many people who voted to leave the European Union ended up being treated in NHS hospitals by European staff. But let's just move back to Windrush and the history of black people working in the National Health Service. Not so long ago, the government at Westminster told NHS workers they would be receiving a 1% pay rise. The administration in Wales, although they haven't come to a figure, have suggested they would offer significantly more, and the Scottish government named a figure of a 4% increase. Now, bear in mind your political background. This may be the most loaded question I'm going to ask you today. Is it maybe more important to encourage black people to vote than it is to get them to join a union?
Okay, what's the most diplomatic answer?
You don't have to be diplomatic, we're all friends here.
Yes, sure, I don't know who's watching. Do you know, Amanda, to be honest with you, I don't think there's an either or with regards to that question.
I agree.
I regularly encourage people to vote. If you don't take a civic participation importantly, then you can't have really strong views that are going to be taken on board. And voting is just one aspect of civic participation. There's so many other ways that you can be involved politically. However, I think that trade union membership complements voting in its own sort of independent sort of way. I think being part of a trade union complements that because you have access to a number of different views. I mean, not everyone in a trade union is of one homogenous political view, and we've seen that over the years with some quite diverse and sometimes quite, sort of horrendous political views coming out of particular members of trade unions. And I think it's important that we all get a sense of what those views are, because ultimately everyone in a trade union who has been drawn to a trade union is a worker, but they've been drawn under a common banner, and it's about being able to reach a consensus with people that you may not share complete views with about what the way forward is for the benefit of people in the workplace. And I mean, you mentioned the NHS and the disproportionate impact of COVID-19. We have to remember that came on the back of austerity, which we were all, that dropped off the kind of radar because once the media stops talking about things, then it's very difficult to keep something in the public domain. But austerity, and then followed by the response to the pandemic and the impacts of the pandemic on ethnic minority people, has been severe. It has been extremely severe. Anyone who's involved in a trade union as a member during that period of time, one would hope that they would have had the opportunity to enjoy the support and advocacy of their trade union in order to just get through, either keep their job, deal with a grievance, deal with performance issues, etc. But a lot haven't had that. So while voting and trade unionism are two separate entities, yes, definitely bring them both together, but also realise that realistically the context that we've been in over a number of years now, not just through the pandemic response, but over a number of years has led to a real uphill challenge for certain marginalised groups. Amanda?
Thank you. That was a great answer. Okay, we'll just step to one side for a moment and talk about union representation really at the top of the pile. And this goes back to other discussions that have been had on Jambo, goes back to what you were talking about, equality, and certainly issues that have been raised about, needing to see people like yourself at the top. That, this is, we've known for the longest time just how important this is. So let me pin this down for our discussion today. The wonderfully charismatic Jamaican-born Bill Morris became the first black General Secretary of a trade union, the Transport and General Workers Union, in 1992. Now I'm going to just stop here and admit that I had not heard either of him, from him, or about him for some considerable time. And I hope he's not listening, but I did actually wonder, whether he was still with us or whether he had passed, gone beyond. And in some ways he has, because he's in the House of Lords. But he's still around. And he was a massively important figure last century for the trade union movement and for black people as a figurehead. The first woman leader of a major union, Unison, is Christina McKenna, and that only happened this year. Now, as we've already mentioned, both black and female membership of the main unions is reasonably proportionately high. Why is it taking so long for black people and women to rise to the top? And to put that in a nutshell, do unions have too much of a white macho image?
simple answer, I believe so.
Yep.
And I believe that it's something that unions do reflect on. Sometimes it can feel that the development of equalities networks within unions might seem sufficient within a trade union to acknowledge that they have addressed an inequality in terms of gender, disability, ethnicity, representation. But you're correct, there are very few people of colour, or indeed prominent women at high levels within the trade union movement. And that might just be well, not might be, but I think it's a simple throwback to how unions originated from very male-dominated workplaces in the first place. But that, again, as I'd alluded to before, is an aspect of trade union key messaging and membership and recruitment that has to evolve during these times. And you can't be what you can't see, as the saying goes. And there is perhaps, I would say, still some systemic discrimination. I think systemic discrimination exists in every sector, either against ethnic minorities or against women or people with disabilities or young people, which is why equalities is so much targeted at these particular characteristics. Policy and legislation is one thing, but without an actual clear strategy to make long-term changes to what this scenario looks like, it's difficult to see how from one union to the next there would be progressive movement. But indeed, from the STUC's perspective and from the Black Workers Committee, those are the messages that we continually chip away at, and we get sick of the sound of our own voices sometimes, but I think, as you alluded earlier on, if you throw enough mud, some of it will stick. So we keep on trying, and as I said, also keep infusing our kids and our younger generation to understand what the issues are. I think one of the worst things that can happen is that people who feel marginalised or who are genuinely marginalised become either tokenistic and not able to perform to the standard of the job at hand, or even worse, become cast down from a post or a responsibility that they're competent at, but for one reason or another are taken away from. And I think that creates resentment and lack of confidence that maybe disengages people from marginalised communities.
Thank you for that. Yeah. I wonder also whether that actually might link back to what we were discussing earlier about the age sort of disparity in union membership, because I do think younger people expect to see more diversity at the top of an organisation, and it those two things may be linked is what I'm saying. So that is an interesting point, and thank you. Okay, I'm going to come to what I think of as another, well, probably the biggest issue when we're talking about unions, something that's incredibly pertinent at the moment and feeds back into, when we're talking about relevance, into everything you've said about the changing workplace, the changing economy, the move to the gig economy, from what we were talking about at the top of the programme with manufacturing, older style industry, etc., and that is the strike. Okay, we've mentioned how getting remunerated and being treated properly in the workplace separates workers from medieval peasants, Russian serfs, indentured labourers, slaves, blah, blah, blah. But the other fundamental right of a worker as we recognise it in the modern civilised world is the right to withdraw one's labour, commonly known as striking. Now, you've mentioned about the genesis of the Labour Party and the unions and its background in white, very male, working class culture. Interestingly, my own political awakening was during the miners' strike. It was happening when I was studying, so quite interesting as a black woman that was the first kind of really big, overtly political issue for me. But going back a little bit, I suppose the iconic strike that any student of history will think of is the general strike of 1926, a sort of all-out strike, obviously very much weighted towards the miners. And in a nutshell, in the short amount of time we have here, I don't think it would be entirely wrong to say that in most of the ways that matter, it was a disaster. The miners went back to work having not achieved what they had hoped to achieve. It certainly did flex union muscle. But then we move forward, as I say, to the miners' strike, which many of us remember as a simply horrendous punishment beating for working class people. We've talked about the way union membership never really recovered. So, putting aside for a moment whether strikes work and the rights people have to withdraw their labour, is there an argument in the modern world, in Britain, in Scotland, for saying that this is just now too blunt a tool? And before you come back on this, I'm going to just pad it out slightly more. We have at the moment ScotRail striking on Sundays, and prior to the collapse of everything with COVID, many people will remember the appalling stories of commuters in the south with the strikes going on down there. Parents weeping because they were not getting home after a day's work to see their kids before they went to bed. And in a world where a lot of these privatised companies are massively protected by public subsidy, by government contracts, and we look and we see the workers who are striking suffering, we see the public suffering, and I'm not entirely sure we see the employers being affected. Talk to me, Gozi, about striking.
Well, a blunt tool. I think back in the day, striking had some level of success when it was used as part of an overall strategy to challenge conditions in a workplace. More recently, I would say that you have a point in making just making those comments about how people at the coalface are the ones who suffer most as a result of striking, as opposed to employers and big business. It's about how do you then impact and have an influence on your cause, your mission within a workplace. Now, a unionised workplace will have much better a much more efficient capacity to be able to bring stripes together. If your workplace is not unionised, it becomes much more difficult to express yourself in that way. For me, I personally would say it's kind of similar to the, you know, getting people to the polling booth idea. That's, you know, there are different things that we have as individuals control over, and for me, one of those big aspects and factors is how you spend your money, where you spend your money. And if that's something that can complement how striking may work to actually have an impact and raise eyebrows across not only just employers, but create sympathies within the general population. I think the thing with striking is that it's lost a lot of sympathetic emotion over time because of how it is considered as to be inconvenient for people who are working, particularly when they need to get home at a certain hour, or they need to pick kids up from childcare, and that creates a stress and a tension and some kind of negativity between the strikers and the general population. So there might be something, I think, that has to be communicated about, well, how do we influence what we do in society to make things change, and who is going to make the changes, who is going to support making the changes. And I think big business can be driven by legislation, but unfortunately a lot of the time big business has politicians and policymakers in their pockets. So it is down to how we as individuals can collectively have some kind of a decision-making voice that takes our cause right to the heart of those who are influencing what we might see as inequalities or injustice.
That's fascinating. And I almost sounded there as if one of the things, you know, you were suggesting as an alternative was almost a kind of domestic boycott system. You know, maybe, yeah, that's something we could think about. Thank you again for that. Okay, just bringing things down now, away from the sort of more high octane questions. Let's get to something as we just move into the last few minutes of the programme. I can't believe it. We may only have time for one more question. Let's see. Unions are massively overstretched. This is something you told me, so I take it from an expert. In terms of what employees are asking of them, and I can only assume that that's partly to do with the current situation, the massive on-block job losses, closures, you know, whether that's in you know, the shops that we've seen close, high street banks, etc., etc. But this obviously is creating huge pressures. Can you just give our listeners an example of some of the very ordinary day-to-day work that a union rep would do?
Well, my brother Rudy is a union organiser, and I've seen his workload increase significantly over the last year. I think with all of the best intentions of our UK government to try and support workers, there have been a number of, you know, quite significant gaps in the support system, in the ability to provide furlough successfully, in the desire to reduce redundancies, in the desire to support people with particular either developmental needs, etc., or training needs if they have to reskill, and the trade union rep has to jump into the middle of all of that. Also, if there are issues around grievance or performance, training, campaigning, a trade union rep will cover all of those areas on a daily basis. And I can't imagine a more demanding job at the moment than a trade union rep. And what I would say to anyone who's even considering becoming a trade union member is don't leave it until you're in the middle of a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
You need to consider how to become a recipient of the benefits of being a trade union member, of which there are many that are not only associated with what advocacy or help or support you can get. There's training, there are various other, sort of more sort of generic benefits like home or car insurance, etc., breakdown cover, that should be appealing to just the general workforce who wants to try and minimise their outgoings, but also have access to that support structure when needed. And trade union reps are constantly sort of vying to try and promote those kinds of benefits, but also to support people who are in the middle of like really difficult crisis. So it's a job that I personally I would struggle to have a day where I wouldn't come back home and be kept up half the night thinking about how to support people in the middle of really, sort of significant and severe crisis.
Thank you. Gozi, thank you so much. We're moving now, just winding down. We're really at the end of the programme. It's been fascinating. This has been our first Talk About programme on Jambo Radio, broadcast from Renfrewshire in Scotland. We hope you have enjoyed this discussion as much as we at Jambo Radio have enjoyed bringing it to you. Massive thanks to our contributor today, Gozi. Thank you so much. Your time, your expertise, your contribution, and from my point of view, for showing that you don't just drag black women out of the cupboard when it's time to talk about being a victim. We are so much more than that, and you've proved that today. Thank you also to DJ Ken and Serena Piotto, who've been our young talent in the studio today, making sure that Granny Amanda doesn't break anything. This show will go out on repeat. Do please check the website, and there you'll find a smorgasbord of other good things that Jambo has to offer. Thanks finally to George Tarr, founder and director of Jambo Radio. Our Talk About topic for next week, hopefully, will be the contactless society. Is it dehumanizing us? We look forward to exploring that with you. Do please take care. Thank you so very, very much for listening. And we will be very much looking forward to sharing this time with you again. And as I get used to being your host, we hope to extend this programme. We have stuck to an hour today with our lovely guest. Eventually, it will be 2 hours, heaven help me. And once we get the hang of that, we will be tagging onto that a phone-in. So anybody out there in Renfrewshire who wants to come back to me about what I said about the Hillman Imp, that could be your opportunity. We have had a super lovely time today on Talk About on Jambo Radio. Thank you so very, very much.